This is our review for our second video test, and we're going to be covering everything from the explorers and Christopher Columbus up through the 7 Years' War and Captain James Cook, and everything that is on the test will be covered in this review session. And almost everything in this review session will probably show up in one form or another on the test. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. All right, so we've covered Columbus, the Renaissance, Age of Exploration, colonization, slave trade, 7 Years' War, lots and lots of things. Videos 21 through 27. The PowerPoints for these classes are up on Schoology, as are the videos, so you should be able to get everything there. So hopefully that's not an issue for you. Okay. Got lots of slides to navigate my way through here today. Okay, we're going to start here. That's not where I wanted to start. Start here. Okay, so there were three sailors that John Green compared in video 21. One Chinese, one Portuguese, and one who sailed for Spain but was Italian. Zhang He was the first, and in many ways sort of the most successful. He had the largest fleet, and he had the largest ships. So Zhang He had the largest fleet, over 200 ships. He had the largest ships. His ships were like 3 times as large as those of Christopher Columbus, who sailed almost 100 years later or 80 years later. He really wasn't an explorer, though. He was covering already known ground in and around the Indian Ocean trade route. And so he had much success in accomplishing his goal, which was really to be a demonstration of Chinese power and to make sure that China stayed the center of attention within the Indian Ocean trade route. So that's Zhang He. And then Vasco da Gama is someone else that John Green talked about, who from 1497 to 1499 had about 3 expeditions around the Horn of Africa over into the Indian Ocean, and with just a couple of voyages and a handful of ships was able to subdue and dominate the Indian Ocean trade that had been going on for hundreds of years. And so the Portuguese became great beneficiaries of the Indian Ocean trade networks. And then, of course, Christopher Columbus, who of the 3 was really the explorer. He's the only one who set out in a new direction, uncharted oceans, and trying to find a passageway to the East Indies, a passageway to Asia. So those are the 3 sailors who were talked about: Zhang He, Vasco da Gama, and Christopher Columbus, all in the 1400s or the 15th century. So the question becomes, if Zhang He was the first of these 3, and he had the largest fleet and he had the largest vessels, why didn't the Chinese dominate the age of exploration in the 1500s? Well, the simple reason for that is that the Chinese government opted for a policy of isolation over exploration and trade. They destroyed the ships. They banned the buildings of new ones. They mandated that all ships had to be single sail and small in size and not ocean-going vessels. And instead they invested all their resources in building a giant wall, the Great Wall of China. And so that was their decision, and that was why they did not take the lead in the age of exploration, although at the beginning of the 1400s they were certainly the best positioned to be able to do so. Portugal instead took the lead, and Portugal had many advantages for taking the lead in the age of exploration. They had an abundant coastline for a very small country. They have a very extensive coastline, and it's all navigable water. So none of this water freezes over in the winter. None of it is in super bad weather. It's all good coastline that can be used for sailing. They also had a natural need for trade because they had a lack of natural resources, so even their lack became an advantage. And then they had early sponsorship of sailing, most principally in the person of Prince Henry the Navigator, who established a school for navigation and sponsored early Portuguese explorations of some of the islands off the coast of Portugal and the western coast of Africa, setting the stage for the breakthrough that the Portuguese made in 1488 with Bartholomew Diaz, who rounded the Horn of South Africa into the Indian Ocean. So John Green in the video makes the point. He says that Christopher Columbus and the Spanish in particular were inspired by the Portuguese and the success that they were having. Unfortunately, he says that they were inspired by Vasco da Gama, who did not sail until 5 years after Columbus, so that was not possible for him to have been inspired by Vasco da Gama. Instead, he was inspired, and they were inspired by Bartholomew Diaz and by these earlier Portuguese explorations, which were mostly along the west coast of Africa. But once Diaz rounded the Horn in 1488, they knew that they needed to find a different way to try to get over to Asia, because they didn't really want to compete with the Portuguese in trying to sail that same route. Okay, so Christopher Columbus. John Green does dispel 3 common myths about Christopher Columbus that people have held on to for years. The first myth is that people in Columbus's day thought that the world was flat. That's not true. People knew that the world was a sphere for hundreds of years before Columbus sailed, and anyone who had any kind of education knew that the world was not flat. Now, it may have still been a myth or a folktale among the uneducated masses, but the educated in Europe all knew that the world was a sphere. The second myth is the myth that Columbus thought he found China. He didn't think he found China. He did think he found the East Indies, and so he named the natives Indians. And even though he went on 3 separate voyages, and even though, other people had gone after him, he died believing that he had found a passageway to Asia. He was wrong, but he was not an idiot. So some people say he was just a lucky idiot who basically stumbled onto this. He was very brave, very knowledgeable, and a good leader of his men. Okay, shifting gears for a moment from Columbus to the Renaissance. John Green defines the Renaissance as an efflorescence, that is a rash or an outbreak of the arts, primarily visual but to a lesser extent literary, and ideas in Europe that coincided with the rediscovery of Roman and Greek culture, or Greek and Roman culture, you could say, if putting it in the proper chronological order. Famous artists, Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, famous scientists like Copernicus and Galileo, famous literary figures including Plutarch and Erasmus. They're all associated with this movement, this time period called the Renaissance. One of the great works of art that actually shows that the people involved in the Renaissance were aware that they were part of an intellectual movement that was rebirthing, rediscovering Greco-Roman ideals and improving upon them. One of the great pieces of evidence to support this is the School of Athens by Raphael. The School of Athens, painted during the height of the Italian Renaissance, depicts many great intellectual figures from the ancient Greco-Roman world, particularly from ancient Greece. And what's significant is that while the figures are supposed to be these guys from ancient Greece, the people that are actually depicted are Renaissance people. So, for example, Plato, who's in the middle on the left, pointing up to the heavens, is Leonardo da Vinci. That's who that is, even though he's supposed to be Plato. And the guy to the right is Aristotle, but Aristotle is Giuliano da Sanglio, who was an important forerunner and mentor to Raphael, and he's pointing down at the earth. So Raphael, one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance, is here intentionally saying, we Italians of the 1400s and 1500s are rebirthing the great treasures of the Greco-Roman world. So there was an awareness of this. Now, why was the Renaissance born in Italy? The simple answer is money. Money, 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 money. Italian city-states were wealthy. They were mini industrial powerhouses. Florence made cloth, Milan made arms, Venice and Genoa had become rich through trade. And so all the money that was there allowed the wealthy people of Italy to be able to sponsor the artists and the architects and the poets, because without a patron and a patronage, you don't get the Renaissance. So was the Renaissance a thing that even happened? John Green says, no, it's not really. It's just overblown. It's like historians created it. But that's not true. And you can find lots of evidence to point to the idea that this was a self-conscious and somewhat organized community movement of artists and intellectuals. And it was centered in Italy. The school of Raphael was one of those pieces of evidence. This is the Florence cathedral, which was paid for by Cosimo the Elder, Cosimo de' Medici. And the Medici family had a lot of money because the Pope had given them a monopoly on the mining of alum in Italy. And they used that money to fund the Renaissance. And shortly after the construction of this cathedral, Cosimo the Elder basically called for the first World Expo in world history, gathering together artists, philosophers, thinkers, scientists from around the world, and they gathered in Florence. And people who were there knew that this was a special gathering of brilliant people. So the Renaissance was a real thing. It really happened, and in many ways people were aware of what was happening at the time. All right, so crossing the ocean, once again, to rejoin what happened with Columbus after he established trade with the New World. Well, something called the Columbian Exchange was established. And one of the important things you need to know from this is some of the plants that were brought from the newly discovered world back to the old world, which had a huge impact on the culture of the old world. So think about tomatoes and how important they are to Italian cooking. Think about tobacco and how important that became to culture within Europe. Think about potatoes and how important they became to Ireland. Corn, how important corn is to the diet not only of people but also of animals throughout Europe, as 60% of corn is used as animal feed. Of course, there were some things that were brought the other way as well. Bananas and cows and chickens and horses and pigs and rice and wheat. So it wasn't a one-way exchange just from the New World to the Old. There was a two-way exchange, and horses certainly transformed the life of Indians, Native Americans, as did many of the other things here. We think of the most famous coffee beans in the world are grown in Central and South America today, but they were originally from Africa. So, but the most powerful thing that was brought over to the New World from the Old was disease, specifically smallpox. And diseases that were introduced to the New World by the European explorers had a devastating effect on native populations. It's estimated that smallpox and other diseases killed more than 50% of the native population, and in some places up to 90% of the native population was wiped out by these diseases that the Europeans did not intentionally introduce them. They weren't trying to kill people. It just was something that most Europeans had an immunity to smallpox by this point, but none of the Native American populations did. And this had a specific effect, especially when powerful political leaders died. It created political instability, which led to war and made conquest easier. But on the positive side, the single biggest impact that all this new food that was discovered and circulated more broadly around the world, the average person worldwide had more food available to them and a better, more rounded diet. And so the world population basically doubled within a 100-year period of time. If you look at where it goes from 50 to 100, between 1400 and 1600, that large growth right in the middle of the chart is due to the Columbian Exchange, the globalization of food, which led to a huge population growth. This was the single biggest impact of the Columbian Exchange. Why were Spain and Portugal so motivated to lead the way in exploration in the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s? Well, part of it is that they had gotten rid of Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula. But John Green repeats a myth that is very clear to understand that it is a myth. He repeats the myth that Muslim rule over the Iberian Peninsula had brought peace, prosperity, tolerance, and a wonderful life for Spain and Portugal. And the truth is somewhat darker than that. Muslim rulers of Spain actually did persecute Christians and Jews, restricted their freedom, and there's no evidence that people lived longer and healthier lives than other people did. And these ideas are explored more in a relatively recent book called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, which is an excellent book if you want to study it further. All right, one other thing was brought from the old world to the new, in addition to disease and pigs and horses and chickens and coffee, slaves. Very early on, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese explorers, they wanted to have large plantations. They themselves were not immune to many of the tropical diseases that were there, the yellow fever, malaria. The native populations were immune to those diseases, but they were very much unwilling to be enslaved, and they were so resistant and so defiant that it became very difficult to mass enslave the Native American populations. And so the Europeans went looking for a group of slaves that they could buy that were immune to tropical diseases, and they found them in Africa. They found them in Africa. African slavery had been going on for probably a couple thousand years before Europeans got there, but Europeans certainly took it to the next level and took it into a bigger, massive trade. In all, 10 to 12 million slaves were brought from Africa to the Americas. Actually, like Rodney Stark's estimates here, probably as many as 15 million were loaded up on the ships in Africa, and probably only about 10 million of those survived the transatlantic trade voyage. Slave ships were horrible, horrible places of death and disease and cruelty. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Atlantic slave trade, however, has been that the idea that Europeans just went over and kidnapped people and brought them over. They did. To be very clear, Europeans did go over and kidnap free Africans who were just, living their lives. But that wasn't where most slaves came from. Most slaves came from African slave traders, and slaves were available to purchase for cheap. You could buy a slave in Africa for about £3, and then you could turn around and sell that slave for about £20 in the Caribbean. So there was an abundant supply of cheap slave labor in Africa, in the slave market that was already established in Africa. But the transatlantic voyage was not good. To maximize profit, they wanted to stuff as many slaves as they possibly could into a ship, and so a ship that was probably designed to only have about 100 people on it would be loaded up with more than 400 slaves, each slave getting the average of about 4 square feet of space, which is smaller than a coffin, which means they were laying on top of each other. There's no other way to fit them on board, so even though these diagrams show everybody side by side, the fact is that they didn't have enough room to be laying flat on a surface, so they were laying on top of each other in a very cramped space, and about 1/3 did not survive the transatlantic voyage. Some of that was due to shipwreck. A lot of ships were lost, and all the slaves died. But then even of the slave ships that made it over, some 15 to 20% of the slaves on board would be dead by the time they arrived. By many measures, the worst place to be a slave was in Brazil. They got the lion's share of the 10 to 12 million, and they had the shortest life expectancy. Around 23 years was the life expectancy of a slave on a Brazilian plantation. In America, working conditions were better, and slaves lived longer, healthier lives. Only about 1/2 of 1% of all the slaves that were brought over made their way to North America. So about 500,000 slaves, and they had a normal life expectancy, and they had children and grandchildren. Doesn't mean things were good for them. This is the paradox of slavery. In many ways, slaves had more rights in Catholic colonies, where the Catholics tried to establish some codes to give slaves some basic level of human rights. They were more likely to be able to own property, to be able to work for themselves outside of the hours of their slavery, to be able to earn their own income, to be able to get married and have those marriages legally recognized. Yet they died earlier because they were worked harder. And then in America, they lived longer because their working conditions were not usually as brutal, but they had fewer rights. They were treated more like pure property. So slavery was not good anywhere. Anybody who says that it was is insane. But the question becomes then, who began the practice of taking black Africans out of Africa and enslaving them abroad? And the answer to that, as John Green agrees, is the Muslims did that back starting in the 700s. Who came up with the idea that black Africans were racially inferior and deserved to be slaves? Well, that was also a Muslim idea. There were two ideals that were vital to the Atlantic slave trade. The first is the idea that slavery could be a hereditary status passed down through generations, and the second is that slavery is a result of human sin. Both of these so-called truths were used to justify slavery. The mark of Cain being a very bad example of how to twist scripture to justify what you want to do. All right, back in the New World, when Cortez arrived, he had an encounter with the Aztec Empire. And Cortez, with a very relatively small group of Spanish conquistadors, was able to overthrow the Aztec Empire. Why is that? Well, part of that is because a central aspect of the Aztec religion was human sacrifice. And not just rarely and on occasion, but in massive numbers on a daily basis. The Aztecs sacrificed thousands and thousands of people. And they were harsh and oppressive imperialists themselves. They had an empire that had dominated and subjugated many native peoples around them, and that's why Cortez was able to find many natives who were willing to help him overthrow the Aztecs, even though for them they were just trading one tyrant for another. And the Aztec capital city was kind of like Venice in that it was built on water, land divided and serviced by canals, had floating gardens. It was very technologically advanced, especially when you consider that all they had were Stone Age tools. But the Aztec bloodshed is one thing that had been denied by sort of historians for a long time, but recent archaeological evidence has made it unmistakably clear that the Aztecs did in fact practice human sacrifice on a large scale, as has always been reported by the Europeans who explored and settled the area. All right, back on the other side of the Atlantic now to the Spanish Armada, 1588. Many historians would say that the Spanish Armada, defeated by the English in 1588, was simply defeated by the weather, just bad luck. And while it's undeniable that weather played a large role, so many Spanish ships were shipwrecked off the coast of Ireland in bad storms, they would have never ended up off the coast of Ireland had the English not been successful in defending their southern coast against the Spanish Armada, which had them greatly outgunned. The English had smaller, faster ships that had better maneuverability. They had better cannons that were higher quality and less likely to explode. They also had better tactics and better leaders. And then there were storms, very bad storms that destroyed many Spanish ships. But before they went up and around to the coast of Ireland, they came through the English Channel, and there were a series of engagements which the English were able to successfully defend. English and the Dutch were able to successfully defend the English coastline. The last of these was the Battle of Gravelines, when the English and Dutch began to use fire ships. They set 8 of their ships, their own ships, on fire and sailed them toward the Spanish. If you're in a large wooden galleon and it's full of cannons and gunpowder, the last thing you want to see is a ship on fire coming for you. So the use of fire ships was a very effective tactic that the English and Dutch were able to use, and there were hundreds of Spanish ships that were sunk either in the battles or along the coast of Ireland. Thousands and thousands of Spanish sailors who were killed. Some 35,000 plus Spanish sailors were killed in battle, and they lost at least 35 of their ships. Fast forwarding a little bit in time, actually quite a lot of it in time, from the Spanish Armada, which was 1588, to the 7 Years' War, which was 1756 to 1763. So we go ahead about 160 years, 170 years. Winston Churchill was the one who called the 7 Years' War the First World War, and it was fought on different continents, in North America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, along the English Channel on the coast of Great Britain and France, in India, between the French and the British settlements there. So Winston Churchill called it the First World War. It was a war between England and France, and it was a war over land and trade, and England won. And by winning and defeating France, they eliminated their major rival for North America, and so the English became really dominant in North America, and then over time they became, because they defeated the Spanish Armada already, they became the dominant naval power and the dominant colonial power in the world over the next coming centuries. One famous English sailor who set sail after the 7 Years' War and explored much of the Pacific Ocean was Captain James Cook. James Cook is probably the most famous English explorer. He mapped out much of the Pacific Ocean, as you can see here, found many groups of islands, mapped the coasts of New Zealand and Australia, went on 3 different voyages over the course of 11 years before he was killed in Hawaii. Quick facts to review about Captain James Cook. He did not discover Antarctica. He got very close, but he actually thought he had proven that there was no such continent as we today know of as Antarctica. So he was wrong, but that was one thing he did not accomplish. He was killed by natives in Hawaii. That's how he died in 1779. He explored much of the Pacific, including many Pacific islands, the coasts of Australia and New Zealand, which he opened up for British colonization. And he was also the one who figured out that scurvy was caused by a lack of vitamin C, and that if you took limes along with you for the trip, you could give your sailors limes and they would not get scurvy. So this is why sailors became known as limeys, and Captain James Cook was responsible for that. He also inspired 2 famous fictional characters, Captain James Hook, the famous pirate from the Peter Pan stories, and Captain James T. Kirk from Star Trek, both characters inspired by Captain James Cook, the famous English explorer. So the last thing you need to know for your test are the civilizations that we've been sort of outlaying in this class, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Byzantine, Muslim, Holy Roman, Renaissance Italy, and the Spanish Empire. We will be adding to this list as we continue on in this class, but these are the 11 that you need to know in order for your test. And last slide for today, these major events, the 13 major events here, which you have this slide up on Schoology. You need to know these in order with approximate dates, so you could do something like, let's say, a matching between these. Okay? That's about all I have for today, and good luck with your studying, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.